Li Wei had always been a quiet man. In fact, you might call him invisible if you didn't know him well, something that could disappear into the background, whether in a laboratory or a crowded subway car. He was the kind of guy who could go days without being noticed, and he liked it that way. Most days, the biggest thing on his mind was whether or not he'd make it through the next round of office gossip without saying something awkward. As a junior lab technician at the Biotech Research Institute, his life was filled with pipettes, petri dishes, and the hum of machinery, nothing to be too excited about. But that all changed on a Tuesday, of all days. It started as any normal Tuesday would. Li Wei had just made his way into the lab, sat at his station, and stared at his work, the quiet buzz of fluorescent lights above his head giving the room an eerie calm. His colleagues, as usual, were busy with their own research, barely acknowledging his presence. He didn't mind. In fact, he preferred it that way. The quieter the world around him, the better. But today was different. It wasn't his experiment, no, it was the experiment he was assigned to help with. Genetic modification had always been a niche area in the lab, and no one really took the task seriously except for the senior researchers. They were working on a project involving ants, specifically, how to increase their strength for industrial use. They had been attempting to splice the DNA of various species to enhance certain abilities in the ants, strength, agility, even improved sensory perception. The project, however, had seen little success. That morning, as Li Wei was setting up some chemical compounds for the experiment, he made an offhand remark about increasing the ant's ability to communicate via pheromones, linking it with genetic traits of the hawk's vision. The idea, though tangential, stuck with him. Why not merge the ant's strength with the keen eyesight of an eagle, or perhaps the speed of a cheetah? In a fleeting moment of arrogance, perhaps a consequence of feeling unnoticed, of feeling small, Li Wei decided to give it a shot. He wasn't a lead researcher, but today, he would try something bold. He mixed a cocktail of the experimental chemicals with a DNA sample of the ants. As he added a small drop of his own genetic material, a decision that seemed strangely intuitive, something happened. The serum began to glow faintly, a shimmering cascade of blue and green that caught his attention. His heart raced. The realization hit him too late. He had accidentally created something that could alter the course of his life forever. At first, nothing happened. Li Wei didn't immediately feel the effects. But then, about 15 minutes later, as he stood up from his desk and reached for a cup of water, his vision blurred, and then sharpened. Like the flick of a switch, everything in the room became crystal clear. He could see the microscopic details on the surface of his lab table, the way the dust particles swirled in the air, the way his skin pulsed with the slow rhythm of life. He felt a strange, exhilarating energy surge through him, something primal. He blinked a few times, not sure what to make of it. Was it the chemicals? Could he have poisoned himself? Then came the sound, sharp, intense. A small buzzing sound. Li Wei turned his head to see a fly buzzing lazily near the open window. Without thinking, his arm shot out, and with a single flick of his hand, he caught the fly between his fingers. He stared at it in astonishment. Had he just? No, it wasn't possible, but when he squeezed his hand, the tiny body of the fly was crushed effortlessly. Shaking his head, Li Wei dropped the fly into the trash can. But his body was already humming with energy. He felt it then, the change. He felt alive, more alive than he had ever been before. Every muscle in his body was awake, alert, and thrumming with power. He ran a hand through his hair, wondering if it was some sort of weird hallucination. But the feeling didn't go away. It grew stronger. It took Li Wei a few hours to realize what was happening. The world around him had shifted. His vision was sharper than ever. He could pick out details he never noticed before. From across the room, he could see the date on a calendar that was tucked in the corner, far from his line of sight. He could hear the faint, almost inaudible hum of a computer fan 2 rooms away. His senses were heightened beyond human comprehension. But then it came, the next wave of change. He felt an itch in his legs, a strange, unexplainable urge to run. He glanced around the lab, wondering if anyone had noticed the unusual energy coursing through him. The thought barely crossed his mind before his body acted. In a burst of speed, he darted toward the open door, sliding through it without breaking stride. He was outside in the blink of an eye, zipping down the narrow hallway like a blur. By the time he stopped, he was several floors down, standing in front of a vending machine. What the hell? He whispered to himself, looking around in confusion. His body still felt charged. He felt light, like he could run forever. The reality hit him hard. Whatever he had done, whatever he had created in that lab, had changed him. His mind swirled with possibilities. Could he be some kind of mutant? A superhuman? He bent down and picked up a plastic bottle from the ground, tossing it high into the air. Without thinking, he jumped after it, catching it in mid-flight before landing gracefully on the ground. His knees barely bent. He felt like a predator on the hunt, with the strength of a lion, the speed of a cheetah, and the vision of an eagle. It wasn't just the power that he felt. It was the urge, the hunger, the primal instinct deep inside him that began to claw its way to the surface. Something inside of him wanted to tear, to fight, to dominate, and that was when the first wave of fear struck him. The following days were a blur for Li Wei. He tried to keep a low profile, trying to understand and control the new abilities coursing through his body. He spent hours in his apartment, pushing his limits. He could run faster than he had ever dreamed possible, his limbs stronger than any weight he had ever lifted. He felt invincible, until he didn't. At first, it was exhilarating. He couldn't help but marvel at the power he now possessed. He ran through the streets, faster than the speeding cars on the highway, leaping over obstacles with ease. He started using his new abilities to do small things, picking up heavy bags for strangers, stopping a bicycle thief from running away. But each act, each small indulgence in his powers, began to leave a mark. The more he used his new abilities, the more he felt himself slipping away from the man he once was. It started with small moments, like when he'd snap at a colleague for interrupting him, or when he felt an odd, almost uncontrollable desire to lash out at someone who cut him off in line at a cafe. He noticed it one night while out for a walk. His steps had turned into something heavier, more deliberate, and the air around him seemed to crackle with a volatile energy. He could feel the tension rising, the urge to do something, anything, to release it. And the more he tried to suppress it, the more difficult it became. His inner world, once calm and controlled, had become a jungle. The beast inside him was growing louder. And now, he was terrified it might take control. Li Wei stood on the rooftop of his building that night, staring down at the city below. His breath came in shallow bursts as he tried to calm his racing heart. The wind whipped past his face, and for the first time, he felt something primal. Alive. He wanted to run. He wanted to leap from this rooftop, to feel the rush of the wind against his face, to soar. He wasn't sure anymore whether he wanted to fly or if he wanted to fall. But the question still lingered in his mind: was he still Li Wei, the technician? Or had he become something else entirely? Something dangerous. Li Wei had never felt more detached from himself. The city buzzed below him, lights flickering in the distance like the distant heartbeat of some enormous, invisible machine. For a moment, he imagined he could feel the thrum of the subway tracks under the earth, the faint tremor of every footstep that passed a block away. It was as if the world was alive in a way it had never been before. Every sound, every movement was magnified, amplified in his senses, overwhelming in its intensity. He could hear his own heartbeat in his chest, a steady rhythm, but somehow, too slow. Too human. The beast inside him clawed at his mind, demanding release. The urge to run, to tear through the streets, to leap into the unknown, was overwhelming. But just as quickly, the thought of giving in to that primal urge terrified him. He wasn't sure what was worse, the animal instincts threatening to take over or the fact that, deep down, part of him wanted to let them, but he clenched his fists, digging his nails into the palms of his hands until the pain snapped him back into himself. He needed to regain control. But the more he tried to control it, the more the urge grew, like a pressure building behind his eyes. Without thinking, he turned and sprinted, ran, across the rooftop. His feet barely made a sound as they hit the concrete. He ran faster than he ever had before, faster than he could have imagined possible, until he reached the edge, his heart thundering in his chest. He stopped at the precipice, the wind rushing around him, lifting his hair off his face. For a moment, he thought about jumping. He imagined the sensation of flight, his body soaring through the night air, free from all the restraints, free from the weight of his thoughts, his fears. But as the thought crossed his mind, the fear came rushing in. He wasn't ready to give in. Not yet. What am I becoming? The question haunted him. The more he tried to fight it, the more the power inside him seemed to grow, to demand release. It felt like being trapped in someone else's skin, something foreign, something dangerous, that he turned away from the edge and collapsed against the wall, taking in deep breaths. His hands shook, his heart pounding in his chest. What was he supposed to do with this? He couldn't tell anyone. Not now. He couldn't risk it. His colleagues, his family, they wouldn't understand. They'd think he was mad. Hell, he thought he might be mad. Maybe he was. The next day, Li Wei sat at his desk in the lab, his hands shaking as he stared at the data on his screen. The experiment had been a success, at least in terms of results. But what good were results if he couldn't control them? Every number on the screen seemed to mock him, reminding him of the shift in himself. How was he supposed to go back to normal, to routine, after this? He couldn't. He wouldn't be the same. He was already becoming something else. That he squeezed his eyes shut and rubbed his temples, trying to focus. Just get through the day. Just make it through one more day, Li Wei. He tried to remind himself that he had always been good at following orders, at doing what was expected. He had always been a silent worker, doing what was asked, not questioning. But now? Now everything felt like it was slipping away, and no matter how hard he tried to hang on, the edge of that cliff was drawing nearer, the ground crumbling beneath his feet. Li Wei, a voice interrupted his thoughts. That he looked up, startled. Dr. Zhang stood at the door of the lab, watching him with narrowed eyes. Dr. Zhang was one of the senior researchers, someone who had always treated Li Wei as a bit of an afterthought. A smart but forgettable technician. "You're awfully quiet today," she said, her voice sharp. Li Wei forced a smile. "Just tired," he said, trying to sound normal, even though his heart was still racing in his chest. It felt like he was holding his breath every time someone spoke to him. Every word, every glance felt like it was probing too deeply, revealing something about him that he didn't want anyone to know. "Are you sure everything is fine?" Dr. Zhang's gaze flicked to his hands, which were still trembling slightly. "I'm fine," Li Wei said quickly, perhaps too quickly. He tried to will his body to calm down, but it was like trying to stop a freight train with a hand. Every muscle in his body was on alert. Every nerve felt like it was humming with energy. Dr. Zhang didn't seem convinced, but she let the subject drop. "We're running some additional tests later. Be prepared to help." She gave him a brief nod before walking away, leaving Li Wei alone with his thoughts again. The moment she was gone, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It wasn't safe anymore. Everything about his life was starting to feel like it was teetering on the edge, about to fall into something he couldn't escape. The following days blurred together. Li Wei couldn't focus. His experiments were increasingly erratic, and he was becoming more unpredictable in the lab. One moment, he would be intensely focused on a task, and the next, his mind would snap, and he would find himself pacing the room or clenching his fists so tightly that his knuckles would turn white. And then there were the outbursts. It was the little things that set him off. A comment from a colleague about how he had done the same thing 100 times, a look of disdain from someone who had always thought him invisible, the sound of a paperclip being dropped in a meeting. These things used to roll off him, but now, they were like matches dropped onto a pile of dry leaves. Every small spark set off a fire inside him, and he could feel the violence building in his chest, a beast clawing at the walls of his mind, urging him to act that he couldn't control it. One afternoon, he was standing in the break room, brewing a cup of coffee, when one of the senior researchers, a man named Yu, made a remark about Li Wei's work. "You know, I don't think you're cut out for this, Li Wei," Yu said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Maybe you should leave the real work to the professionals." Li Wei turned slowly, his hands trembling as they gripped the coffee mug. He felt the urge to do something, anything, to lash out. The air felt thick, charged. Yu smirked, clearly unaware of the storm brewing inside Li Wei. "What's the matter, Li Wei? Cat got your tongue?" The words were like a trigger. Before he even realized what he was doing, Li Wei's hand shot out, knocking the mug off the counter. It flew across the room, crashing against the wall with a deafening smash. Yu jumped back, startled, but Li Wei's vision was blurring. His muscles screamed with tension, and for a moment, he didn't recognize himself. All he could hear was the pounding of his own blood, the voice of the beast inside him urging him to act. Yu stood frozen, eyes wide. Li Wei realized that everyone in the break room was staring at him now. The room was silent. A cold wave of shame washed over him, and he suddenly felt sick. He had almost lost control, again. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. He turned on his heel and rushed out of the room, leaving behind the stunned silence. That night, Li Wei didn't sleep. He sat in his apartment, staring at his reflection in the window, watching the city lights flicker below. His eyes were bloodshot from lack of rest, his face pale with exhaustion. He hadn't been able to push the thoughts from his mind, the endless, restless hunger gnawing at him. He had to fix this. He couldn't keep going like this. His hands curled into fists as he looked down at the streets below. There was only one way to solve this, to regain control. He had to confront it. He had to confront the beast inside him before it swallowed him whole. The next day, he went back to the lab. He didn't tell anyone what had happened. He didn't need to. He couldn't let anyone see how close he was to losing it. But something had changed in him. He wasn't just the technician anymore. He wasn't just the quiet man who blended into the background. He was something else now, something that didn't fit into the mold he had once lived in. As he walked into the lab, he felt the weight of his own power, the surge of adrenaline and primal energy coursing through his veins. It was like standing at the edge of a cliff, staring down at the abyss, knowing that one wrong step would send him plummeting, but he couldn't stop now. The beast inside him was awake. And it wasn't going to let him go without a fight. Li Wei hadn't fully comprehended the gravity of what he was becoming until that morning. The air felt thicker in the lab, heavier with an unspoken tension that weighed down on him more than any experiment ever had. His eyes were bloodshot, his face taut with exhaustion. The restless energy he'd tried to suppress last night had only grown, gnawing at him from the inside. Every movement in the lab felt exaggerated, every sound sharp and grating on his senses. He wasn't just perceiving the world anymore, he was feeling it with the intensity of a predator. He couldn't stop himself. It was like living in a constant state of hyper-awareness. His hands gripped the edges of his workstation so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His eyes flickered to his colleagues, but they seemed so distant, so unaware of what was happening to him. How could they understand? How could anyone, as he worked, assembling petri dishes and checking chemical solutions, the weight of his transformation felt unbearable. His fingers twitched with the impulse to act, to do something. His body was restless, itching for release, while his mind screamed for control. The temptation to test his limits, just once more, was overwhelming. He told himself he could wait. That he had to wait. But then he saw it. The clipboard, left carelessly on the desk, the notes with precise details about the ants, how they had been modified, how their senses had been enhanced. They had tried to apply these traits in small doses, to improve the ants' ability to carry objects, communicate, and work in tandem. But Li Wei had already seen what was possible. If ants could have the strength of a lion, why couldn't he? His heart pounded as his gaze shifted to the nearby lab equipment. The syringes, still clean, still unused, stood silently on the counter, a dangerous temptation. He'd read the notes about the mixed genetic cocktail, about how even a small dosage could cause unimaginable changes in cellular structure. And now that he understood what had happened to him, the idea of going further, it felt like a promise. For a fleeting moment, the idea of pushing further, of amplifying his senses and abilities even more, consumed him. His hands trembled as he reached for the syringe. He could hear the faint, familiar sound of footsteps outside the lab door. Dr. Zhang's voice called through the intercom, "Li Wei, can you run the final test for me? We need to move quickly on this." The sound of her voice snapped him out of his trance, and he dropped the syringe back onto the counter. He exhaled sharply, pressing his hands against his temples as though he could quiet the storm brewing inside him. There was no turning back, not unless he could find a way to control this beast inside of him. "Coming," he called out, trying to sound calm. His voice felt foreign, like he was wearing a mask. He knew it was only a matter of time before someone noticed how far gone he was. The days that followed were a blur of heightened awareness and tense silence. Every task felt like a struggle, an exercise in restraint. Li Wei could no longer ignore the constant hum of power that ran through his veins. It was like a fire that burned from the inside out, making everything feel too sharp, too intense. He couldn't focus the way he used to, couldn't drown out the noise in his head. During meetings, he found it hard to stay still. His legs itched to run, to spring into action. He was a coiled spring, ready to snap. His thoughts were increasingly erratic, his emotions swinging between irritability and fear. He knew what was happening. He knew it, deep down. The beast wasn't just a metaphor. It was real. And it was getting stronger. One night, Li Wei decided to take a walk. His apartment, once a safe haven, now felt suffocating. He needed air. Needed to escape from the walls that felt like they were closing in on him. The streets outside were quiet, a deep, lonely silence blanketing the city. He had come to hate the stillness. The hum of the lights, the rustle of distant leaves in the wind, it all felt too predictable, too human. He was no longer human. Not entirely. He had become something else, something untamed and wild. As he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on him, the pressure building inside his chest. Every shadow seemed to shift, every streetlight flickering in his peripheral vision. He was being watched. But by who? The thought sent a shiver down his spine, and he quickened his pace, the urge to run now undeniable. He turned a corner and saw a man, no, a teenager, standing in the alley, hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. The boy was alone, and Li Wei's senses honed in on him instantly. His heart rate spiked as he recognized the danger. The boy was holding something. What? A knife? A bottle? The instincts in Li Wei's chest flared, hot and dangerous. Every muscle in his body screamed for action, the predator in him alive and roaring. But before he could think, before his mind could catch up, his body had already reacted. His legs propelled him forward, faster than he'd ever moved, and in an instant, he was standing in front of the boy. The teenager flinched, his hands going up in surprise, but Li Wei was already past him, grabbing the knife out of the air before the boy could even react. The motion was so fluid, so effortless, it felt as though time itself had slowed down. "Hey," the boy stammered, eyes wide with shock. He tried to back up, but his words were swallowed by the quiet intensity of Li Wei's gaze. The predator's gaze. Li Wei stood there for a moment, staring down at the boy, his chest rising and falling with each shallow breath. The hunger was there, deep within him, urging him to strike, to take control of the situation. To feel the power of his hands around the boy's throat. To make him submit. But then, slowly, the noise in his head quieted. The urge to act began to fade as reality set in. He let go of the boy, who staggered back in fear. "You're lucky," Li Wei muttered, his voice low and unfamiliar. Without another word, he turned on his heel and walked away, leaving the terrified teenager in the alley. It was too close. Too close. That night, Li Wei lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. He couldn't remember the last time he'd slept without feeling this raw, this dangerous. He was living on the edge, and he could feel the crack in his mind growing wider. He had moments of lucidity, moments where he could tell himself to breathe, to stay grounded. But those moments were becoming rarer. The next day, he couldn't keep the facade up any longer. At the lab, Dr. Zhang approached him, her brow furrowed. "Li Wei, we need to talk." He froze, his heart skipping a beat. He could already feel the pulse of adrenaline thrumming in his veins, and his mind screamed at him to run. To leave before she said something that could unravel him completely, but he couldn't. "Not now." "What is it, Dr. Zhang?" he asked, his voice sounding distant, hollow. "You've been acting off," she said bluntly, eyeing him closely. "Is something going on with you? I've noticed your work has been erratic, and I know something's wrong. If you need help, we can." "I'm fine," he interrupted, his voice coming out sharper than he intended. The beast inside him stirred, but he fought it back. He needed to stay composed. He needed to. "No, you're not." Dr. Zhang's gaze softened, but the concern in her eyes only made things worse. "Li Wei, whatever is going on, we can help you." She was too close. The pressure in his chest was building, his body tense with the need to lash out. He could feel his vision narrowing, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His hands shook with the effort to hold it together. The beast was right there, just under the surface, ready to break free. "No," he whispered. "I can't let you." Before he could finish the sentence, his body moved on its own. In one fluid motion, he grabbed Dr. Zhang by the arm, pulling her close. His grip was too tight, too strong, and she gasped in pain. But something in his mind, something deep inside him, snapped. And in that instant, Li Wei saw the truth. He wasn't in control anymore. He had lost it. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice trembling. He released her and stepped back, horrified at what he'd just done. He had come so close to losing everything. He turned and bolted from the lab, the sound of his footsteps echoing behind him like the drumbeat of his own heart. Li Wei didn't know where he was going. He couldn't go back to the lab. He couldn't go home. He was too far gone. There was only one place left for him to go.